When we're going through our experiment process, we think in terms of like low fidelity, medium fidelity, and high fidelity. You know, the levels of risk and reversibility increase as the fidelity increases. And so really outlining that and being clear with our business partners has helped a ton.
Welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello and welcome to episode 56 and to 2019. Before we jump in, I just wanted to stop for a moment and thank each and every one of you for listening. Thousands of you have been listening to the show for the past year, and more join us each week. I cannot thank you enough for all the support. 2019 is going to be a big year. There will be more live shows, video content, and now there's even a newsletter for you to keep tabs on when and where this new content will be available. Head to schmidt-list.com and subscribe to the monthly newsletter. And today I'm excited to have Brandon Jernigan on the show. Brandon and I talk about how large companies like Target and Amazon test new products with customers. And we also discuss ways to manage expectations of senior leadership when launching innovation initiatives. Again, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Brandon. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's good to see you. So you and I have talked a bit in the past, hung out a little bit, and you, like me, have had kind of a windy road into this industry, into digital and technology and all of that. Kind of, how did you end up doing what you're doing now?
It's a wonderful question. I think we have the blessing and curse of curiosity.
Yeah.
And for me, I was a finance undergrad and graduated into the world of finance and didn't really know what that meant. Worked in management consulting for a couple of years. At the time, it was when a lot of corporate bankruptcies were happening. So Enron.
So good times.
Great times. Great times for a bankruptcy consultant, but not so great times for the economy and a lot of large companies. So at the time, there were a lot of exciting headlines and a lot of large corporate problems worth solving. And so I went and worked for PwC for a couple of years and got to work on Enron. And
before we get started, I wanted to mention that I'm available to speak at your organization or conference on how to establish a growth mindset. Hit me up at Kurt, that's K-U-R-T, Kurt at foundrymakes.com to learn more. Speaking of Foundry, head over to foundrymakes.com to learn more about how we accelerate innovation in companies big and small. That's foundrymakes.com. And now, on with the show.
Of traveling and staying in nicer hotels and flying, nicer class, all the while you're going into these companies and you're seeing people walking out with boxes and tears. And that just really didn't sit well with me. So I started to explore, what other career opportunities might exist within finance, because that's kind of the only thing I knew.
Yeah.
I went to the investment side for a year at Prudential Capital. And again, I never really aspired to be any of my bosses. I kind of enjoyed the subject matter, but not so much the environment. I didn't really see a career path.
Inspiring?
It wasn't, actually. It wasn't exciting. Yeah. It wasn't exhilarating. It was in oil and gas, which I didn't really know much about or couldn't really relate to. This was in Texas at the time, so you can imagine the types of people attracted to that type of environment. And just had more creative interests at the time. And I grew up competitive swimmer. I swam through college. Swimming ate up all of my free time.
Yeah.
So once I graduated and had free time, I had more creative interests. I started painting. I started building furniture. Started getting into photography. And wanted to start to earn a living doing something more creative than what I was doing. Coincidentally, moved up to Minneapolis from Texas, got involved in advertising. A really robust ad community here, unbeknownst to me at the time.
Yeah, it's hard to, it's amazing. I was just speaking with somebody about the scale of it. I mean, it's not that far behind the New Yorks and the San Franciscos and Los Angeles in terms of per capita.
Yeah. I think for me, it was, at the time, it was, top 3, top 5 ad towns in the country. And it just blew me away. And it was a perfect environment for me to get introduced to advertising because of the sort of Midwest culture opposed to a coastal culture, a little bit more tolerance and forgiveness. And somebody like me coming in blindly and coming in to ad strategy. And what was that? And why did I have credibility there? But I really kind of used my more fundamental business and strategic sort of background and just applied it in a more creative capacity in advertising. And so worked a couple years in that, and then just realized, I was facilitating the creative process. I wasn't actually creating. And so a couple of years after that, I left and kind of started my own photography and art direction business, moved to New York, ran away for about 5 years and had a wonderful time. But at the time it was 2007. And so if you're a history buff, 2008 is kind of when the Great Recession happened. And that can be a very challenging city to live in. And I lived there with my now wife, who was also working in advertising, but she had quit her job and became a costume designer and wardrobe stylist. So here's two young, people in their late 20s in New York City in the Great Recession working for themselves in a creative community. And ad budgets, we were still working in advertising. Ad budgets are some of the first to get cut in a recession. And
those seem like nice to haves when you don't have much money.
Yeah, exactly. But that really taught us a lot about ourselves and how scrappy and resilient and entrepreneurial we're just wired. That was kind of a big learning and takeaway. So despite a Great Recession, despite working for ourselves in a creative job market, we were still, very successful. And then, the thought of starting a family started to enter our minds, and the realities of doing that in New York were unrealistic. And we kind of explored our short list of cities.
It's a bit pricey there.
It's a little bit expensive. Yeah. It's not entirely the easiest city. If you're into CrossFit, it might be a great city for you to be a young parent carrying the strollers up and down stairs. And it's insane. It's bonkers. So we moved back here. My wife got a great job opportunity. I was getting involved in the entrepreneurial community in New York and started to do the same here in Minneapolis, and found it to be incredibly robust and open. And I think Smart Things at the time was kind of the local darling. And, kind of being on the earlier side of IoT and connected products, it was exciting to see just that type of mentality and resiliency and scrappiness here in the Midwest and in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
So I started to knock on a couple of those doors and ultimately ended up getting my MBA. So I've got this weird, meandering, curious career from business and finance to advertising to entrepreneurship and photography. And then I went back to graduate school to really mash up all of those interests into something a little bit more kind of bundled or more easily communicable to future employers. And really mashed up that entrepreneurial background, strategic point of view, and creative interests. And then found the team at Target that I joined about 3.5 years ago. So long-winded answer.
That's great.
But a very long kind of meandering story.
Yeah. And so when you landed at Target, I'm guessing, that was also a time, Target's always changing a bit, but that seemed to be a bigger time in Target's time where they were really okay, no, for real, we got to do some disruption here.
Yeah, and this was 2015, and they had just had their massive round of layoffs months before I started, and I think they learned a couple of hard lessons on how and how not to quote unquote innovate, and how to do that in a more thoughtful and exploratory and experimental and lean startup-y way. And so, the ingredients between sort of Target struggles with Canada, and they also had a data breach.
Right.
On top of retail being flipped upside down with Amazon, blowing the roof off of the industry, was really an interesting and perfect time for me to join this team. And it's called the Ideas team. And it really is, if you're familiar with IDEO and sort of their business model, it started with, traditionally industrial designers who put people at the center of all the problems they're trying to solve and the products that they design. And the way that the team is staffed is you have industrial designers, you have anthropologists, you have UXers, you have people who have an MBA but aren't necessarily a classic, business consultant or management consultant. And you have entrepreneurs who have kind of been out in the world and understand what it means to be scrappy and resilient and to beg, borrow, and steal for resources.
What were some of the things that really either surprised you or, either positively or negatively when you first joined that team?
When I first joined, I was completely naive. I had been working for myself for about 8 years, and now I'm joining a $70 billion company with
big company,
tens of thousands of employees. And when I joined the team, we were chartered with go find new ways for Target to make money. We're not going to necessarily hold you accountable to sales today. We want to kind of charge you with tuition. And so how do you go out and just learn? It was called the Style Innovation Team at the time, and style was sort of a key initiative for the company. But what is style? right? How do our guests define it? Why is it important? And then where might there be business model opportunities or innovative opportunities around style? And so it was a really exciting time for me to join, because it was this big sort of vague, ambiguous space. And for somebody curious like myself and others on the team, it was incredibly exciting. And we had a pretty robust budget with very little sort of KPIs or less rigid KPIs. And so kind of like keys to the city. And that was incredibly exciting, because we got to get out into the world. You could partner with a startup. You could acquire a startup. You could try to spin up the own capabilities in-house. And so to have that luxury of, building, buying, or partnering with somebody was pretty incredible.
And that's interesting, because it brings up something that specifically I wanted to talk to you today about, was that point about how unstructured it is. Where I've seen issues happen is where it's too unstructured, where people assume that in order to innovate, you got to take all the chains off, and just free yourself and tear off your clothes and run around like a crazy person. And now we'll innovate, right? And then we'll add some beer on tap and dogs and beanbags and stuff. And then
the obligatory ping pong table,
obviously, maybe a foosball table, but that unstructured things start to erode away at the ability to actually have impact. How did you experience that? How did you combat that? How have you found success in that kind of balance between being free and being able to go and do whatever, but yet still some structure where there's some accountability?
Phenomenal question. I think we had that rare ability to run around naked, as you say, as it were, at a large company. Those sort of reins quickly came in. And so the leash got a little bit shorter as executives and budgets were being reviewed at the end of the year, and how much money are we going to have to reallocate or rededicate to a team like this? What sort of results are they showing? And for us, we really, at that time in 2015 is kind of when Lean Startup was becoming a little bit more popular. And so we as a team and our team leader kind of had the foresight to see the value of Lean Startup, and not just doing things in a lean way. And it's not just about speed, but it's, those incremental learnings, but also holding yourself accountable to key results, to KPIs. And we didn't necessarily have that. We were learning what those were. And so we as a team went out to the Lean Startup Conference. We had a Lean Startup coach come in. And so we really kind of, in a way, home grew, as well as reached out to external experts to help us add a little bit more structure.
And then what about measurement? So you had mentioned there were certain KPIs and things, but what did you find worked and didn't work in terms of the measurement front from your experience in that situation?
Yeah, and 3 years later, I think at the time, 3 years ago, I was fooling myself and thinking that there were really alternative forms of value that we could explore that were almost equally as important to the organization. And I believe that to be slightly true today. I do believe in separating market value and strategic value, particularly in the spirit of innovation. So market value, how big is the opportunity? How many top line sales, or how profitable is this going to be? That makes sense. Share of voice, market share, et cetera. And then from a strategic point of view, if we can't predict the future, how do we hope to be on the right side of history? How do we start to place a little bit more riskier bets that don't have those market value payoffs today, but we anticipate might tomorrow? And so that's actually been helpful in communicating to our leaders upwards on distinguishing between market value and strategic value, acknowledging that the ideal solution elevates and maximizes both, but at various points in an innovative project or product, those things are going to be evaluated differently.
And then what about the vision side of it? One of the things that I've experienced in the past is kind of somebody's just coming up with these broad terms of like, we want to become the number one blah, blah, blah. So now go and innovate towards this thing, right? Now, don't get me wrong. It's okay to have these sort of big, hairy, audacious goals or things, right? But how do you kind of rein that in, especially when you're managing up, Brandon, right? Yeah. You're trying to manage those expectations around what you're going to get out of this innovation sort of approach, right?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes teams will come to us and they won't have necessarily a goal or a strategic choice as we would kind of define a goal or strategic choice. We love having problems to solve to the extent they're people problems. We love that. Oftentimes we'll receive a project and it's a business problem, right? We need to increase sales by X. Like, okay, well, why is that important? Who are you really solving for? What jobs are they trying to get done? So we tend to think, like, if we don't have that coming in, we'll go out and explore that. So we'll go out and do our ethnographies and talk to people. What are their pain points? What problems are we trying to solve? We talk in terms of jobs to be done, which is a common framework out there. But acknowledging and educating our leaders that there are different types of jobs. There are functional jobs, which are the jobs that we typically think of. There are also emotional and social jobs that are equally important. They may be those deeper problems, kind of that third, fourth, and fifth why, if you're out there doing research. And then we'll try to articulate and come up with some strategic choices for our leaders to make. And we think of strategic choices. We use Roger Martin's strategy cascade, where to play, how to win framework. And one of the bigger takeaways from that framework is really what a strategic choice is and isn't. And for us, it's a choice between left and right, not good and bad. And oftentimes you receive a strategy or a goal from a business team, and it's that good or bad choice. We want sales to go up by 20%.
Right.
Well, that's not necessarily a strategic choice, right? So it's the how and the why behind that we really help teams explore, and to make sure that that's really driven by our consumer base.
How do you handle it? Maybe you've experienced this, maybe you haven't. I know I have. Is when somebody says, okay, no, that's cute, Brandon, but I need sales to go up. Like, I appreciate all your fancy talk about strategy and all this stuff, but I need sales to go up or we're in trouble. Right?
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to your earlier question about metrics of success. And for a while, I was thinking, okay, there are other forms of value, as I mentioned, that we could explore. But at the end of the day, a lot of our teams, money talks, right? And oftentimes, it's top-line sales for a lot of our merchants. At best, we can sort of coach them on bottom-line profitability implications. Are there some operational efficiencies we can gain by creating a different solution or a different path to a solution? That's helpful. But we also think about, oftentimes in a project, we'll need to go slow to go fast later. And by going fast, we're talking about scalability. We're talking about sales. We're talking about, those top-line goals.
Right.
But to get there, we firmly believe in validating through rapid experiments four key areas. And that's, consumer desirability. That's the technological feasibility. Can we pull it off? Can we scale it? That's the commercial viability. Will it make money? If so, how much? What's the market size, et cetera? And then the fourth one being that strategic alignment. So the desirability, feasibility, viability all need to be aligned with the strategic choices for the enterprise and also for the business team. And we'll go out and oftentimes not know anything about any of those four criteria. But we'll go out in field and we'll put the guest first, and we'll go out and have an evidence-based sort of guest-driven proposal or product portfolio or whatever we're working towards.
In those scenarios, one of the other areas I've experienced some friction, I guess I would say, is on who owns that guest, who owns the customer, who actually has the right to go and have these conversations with people. How have you navigated those conversations before?
It's challenging. I mean, with a company as large as Target, for example, they have, we'll call it 150 million guests or consumers. Part of the challenge is to know who to focus on and who to solve for. Occasionally, business teams or the company, while our guests are sacred, right, they're not as fragile as we believe them to be. And so helping the teams understand that it might be risky for us to go out and talk to a consumer or to put an imperfect solution in front of them, but is that risk reversible or not? And so we'll often talk in terms of reversibility or irreversibility. And Jeff Bezos talks about this in terms of his two-way door decision-making process. Is it something that we can back away from, and how risky is it? And you'd be surprised, how such a simple narrative can have a big impact on opening doors for us and our team, because oftentimes those decisions are reversible at the end of the day. And then we also are very mindful and show that we're doing our diligence and very thoughtful and methodical in how we're introducing a new solution to a consumer, making sure that expectations are set and managed, but we're doing that in a mindful way, so we're not totally biasing that experiment.
Yeah, it seems like a fine line, right?
It's a really difficult challenge. So a couple of different experiments we run are, false door tests, where what you see isn't necessarily what you get. It might be a landing page with some sort of value proposition or business model, and we're asking for a piece of your information, and that's all you really know about it. For us, we tend to validate our learnings on some sort of value exchange, and ideally it's currency, so actual financial transaction. Oftentimes earlier in a project, it's not financial. It could be privacy, so some piece of information, a first name, a last name, a telephone number, an address, an email address, etc. And so that's kind of helpful to help our teams know that what pieces of information are we collecting and why, how reversible or complex is this decision, how many guests will it impact or not, how much financial implications might it have from a cost perspective in building out this experiment. And so when we're going through our experiment process, we think in terms of like low fidelity, medium fidelity, and high fidelity. And, the levels of risk and reversibility increase as the fidelity increases. And so really outlining that and being clear with our business partners has helped a ton.
Yeah, because if something looks done, it looks done, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's why in my early days of doing web development and app development, we would do a lot of wires in Illustrator or something like that, but then we would end up just tracing them
right.
just to demo to the client so they looked more rough.
Yeah.
Because what I found is that when we put the more very straight and narrow wires, it got a very different reaction than for me to go through and just spend a little time tracing them very broadly. Yeah. The client would get more involved and they would write on the paper and things. It got more collaborative.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing we find too, is just that open door policy for us and being more collaborative, and bringing the guest in and always deferring to the customer to settle any debates. So oftentimes we'll have conversations on should we do this or that, and we really haven't asked the guests. And so that's another way for us to gain credibility and access to the guest with our leaders is, I don't know, let's ask them. And then to also ask them, depending on what we're asking them, it could be a sketch, it could be a wireframe. Oftentimes we'll work in physical products too, and it could be some sort of rendering. But we would even start, much lower fidelity than that.
Yeah, I love that you talked about that two-way door, because I can see if you're very deliberate about it, you can find a way to back it out pretty easily. Like Amazon releases a phone, and it's a pile of junk, but nobody really talks about that. Nobody really. It's not really it's not like a Google Plus or an Apple Maps sort of lore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As much, right? And I think that's probably the way you said, there was a very deliberate, we could put this out there and then back it out if we need to.
Yeah. I mean, Amazon can be a polarizing company for some, particularly in this day and age of their scale and influence and impact. One of the things that I admire for them is just how they've earned that right to innovate and earn the right to publish a headline and to write an article about a product that doesn't even exist yet because they're exploring it. And, we have a ways to go in that regard at Target.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of places too, to be honest. I don't think it's a problem just at Target.
That's true.
But I think what I like about what Target's doing is that it's constantly trying new things internally. It's not afraid. Yeah. To, maybe like you said, you have to be very careful on what you expose to the guests and things. But internally, the culture seems like it's okay to kind of bump into walls a little bit and try some things. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, right?
I came in at a bit of a unique time. Again, kind of a new CEO had come in. Canada had happened. We had placed some riskier bets that weren't paying off. But with the new leadership, and that's kind of at the executive level and senior level as well, just a unique outside perspective gets a lot of credibility and gives us a longer leash on what we're exploring and how we're exploring it, because there's a sense of urgency for them too to come in and change things up and make a difference. And so with that, the leadership has really done a great job of communicating and articulating what our strategic priorities are, and then giving the teams who are in the trenches a little bit more latitude on how to explore and how to activate those strategic choices.
That's good.
And so for us, that really opens things up for us and makes our jobs a lot easier.
Let's say, Brandon, I plucked you out of Target and I put you into another, maybe not so big company, but maybe more of a mid-size, or maybe I'm listening to this and I feel like my company could use some innovation and we need a more deliberate approach to it or something. Like, where would you start if you were coming into a new place and they were like, we need to innovate? Where would you first suggest, like, this is where we need to start building that as a practice or a discipline?
That's a great question. I'm sure a lot of listeners and companies out there are maybe kicking around that same question themselves. I've seen the term like strategy and innovation, which are both in my title on LinkedIn, get thrown around and used very, very loosely.
Yeah.
And I think they've become sort of the words du jour from startups and leans and innovation and strategy. And at the end of the day, it's why. Why are those things important? So I would ask, somebody asking me that, like, why do you think you need to? What do you think your consumers are trying to achieve and are struggling the most with? To acknowledge that there's perhaps some front-end innovation type of stuff and some back-end innovation stuff. So where do you find the biggest gaps in your organization is today? But more importantly, why? But more importantly, like, why? Right. And then that would help you start. So let's assume it's a front-end innovation. So that's where I have most of my experience. And there are numerous frameworks and philosophies out there. You could probably, you'd grow old reading all of them. And I'm kind of a framework junkie. And at the expense of over-engineering, which you can't do or shouldn't do an innovation program, I would really look at design thinking. And because that historically has always put people at the center of solutions, but more importantly, the problems that they're encountering, the most underserved problems. And then they kind of work towards a more iterative approach to prototyping, so you can reduce risk, reduce expenditures, but also accelerate learnings. And so for us, because we reside within product design and development, because sort of our team's founders were industrial designers, we have at the core of our team a very much human-centered design thinking DNA. But I feel like that only gets you so far. If you look to the lean startups, kind of those principles and philosophies that build, measure, learn, that experiment loop, adding a little bit more pseudoscience or rigor to your learning plan or experimentation plan has been helpful for us to think in terms of, how quickly can we put something in front of somebody to validate a behavior, not just what they say. And again, I mentioned earlier, validation for us is this exchange of value. Right? Ideally, there's some sort of currency exchange. It may be just time. How much time are they spending on a site or doing a particular activity, or are they exchanging something other than money? Is it information? Is it a referral, etc.? But again, that only gets you so far, right? And then you start to integrate a little bit more of the sort of business aspects. Considering scalability, considering maybe some of those operational and go-to-market considerations. And that's where I feel like Agile is a wonderful sort of way to work just in general, but particularly when projects get to, that lower to medium fidelity. I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on about frameworks. There's no right one, but I would always put, people at the center of what you're working on and why.
I think one of the most important skill sets to have when you're working in R&D or an innovation team or whatever they call it is those people skills, because you're working, and you mentioned you had a very multidisciplinary team. Lots of different backgrounds, come from a lot of different groups. Not everybody has had the kind of more all over the map sort of experience like you and myself have, right? What are some of the ways you found success in being a part of a multidisciplinary team in an organization like Target? Within
our team, and then within sort of our clients, if you will, our internal clients, because we are sort of human-centered designers, because we are and believe firmly in empathy, we always try to think in terms of what's in it for the other person, but also to acknowledge other people may communicate or learn or be convinced differently than you yourself. So for me personally, I learned a lot early on how to tell a convincing story with some imperfect information, and to not let just the data tell the story, but also to communicate that story in a way that resonates with the audience. And for a lot of people, we kind of did this study as a team where, are you a visual learner or communicator? Are you an auditory learner or communicator? Are you more of a kinesthetic learner or communicator? So are you seeing things? Are you hearing things? Are you interacting with things? Mm-hmm. And then to approach storytelling in that way, but also with the audience in mind. And I've also learned working with our business teams that their business problems are, in fact, extremely important, and not to discredit them by saying, well, okay, what's the guest problem? What's the human problem? But really, what's at the center of the business problem and the human problem? And so for them to acknowledge that there's another set of problems that's consumer related that they should be aware of, and that I'm not totally ignoring sort of their business objectives. But at the end of the day, if we could solve both, that's really what our team is all about.
Yeah, that's where I've seen a lot of people struggle, especially when they're new to an industry. It takes a little bit of time to get experience to understand that business side of things, especially when you're the creative, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the things I coach a lot of user experience people on when they say, like, what should I be doing to get my first job and things? I'm like, understand the business, understand the business side of things, understand how they're making money and what they're doing with that money and what all those things are. And then, absolutely focus on the user needs and all those things. But it's a balance, right?
Yeah, it's way more easier said than done.
It is.
Having worked sort of in creative roles at various companies, there always seems to be this like hard line or chasm between the creatives, quote unquote, and the strategists or the business people, quote unquote. And at the end of the day, you both should be solving the same problems for the same people. And the really great agencies and teams acknowledge that and can work together from day one and really, accelerate results. And
I think it's a real culture thing more so than a process thing.
Yeah. I went through, and just one kind of project anecdote was, I worked on this 3-month sprint for our chief executives at Target. And the way the team was staffed from day one is it had, your UX designer, it had a strategic designer, it had an engineer, it had what they called a growth hacker, so somebody who's out there doing the kind of data analytics and everything. Mm-hmm. It also had a unique role called a venture architect, so an entrepreneur who had been out in the world and actually built a business, not just a T-shirt in the garage sort of business, but a sizable business that had been acquired and exited. So they understand, how the sausage really gets made out in the world, not just from a corporate perspective. Mm-hmm. But you had this unique cross-functional team from, traditional management consultant to engineer to designer, all at the table from day one. And not everybody led all at once. That would have been chaotic. But different teams and different individuals led at different points. But there was no lumpy handoff of information. Nothing got lost in translation. And everybody brought a unique perspective every day. And that was one of the more enjoyable and rewarding experiences.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
If you can do it, that's what you need. That's the team you need, right?
Yep.
That's very cool. Yeah, I think a lot of startups today, one of the things we experience here at Foundry, because, a number of our clients are startups too, but we also work with pretty large corporations. The startup people are always struggling for that technical co-founder to be a part of it. They've got the great idea, but to be able to figure out what the right technology choices and technology approaches and things are is very difficult. A lot of times we take on that role for them for a time while they're searching for that person. But I can imagine, similar inside a large organization, there's not a lot of difference when you're trying to be lean, like you're talking about, right?
Yeah. And the other thing too is, and this is on just something that I constantly remind myself of, but it's a Salvador Dali quote, and it's, perfection doesn't exist, so there's no point in really pursuing it. And I need to remind myself of that. But that helps teams kind of move forward in a more lean and scrappy and imperfect way, to be okay with failure, to be okay placing more riskier bets with imperfect or, incomplete information. And I think that's been another really powerful way to communicate to our leadership. We're going to make the best choice given what we know today. Mm-hmm. It may be imperfect. It not necessarily will be the right choice, but we need and believe firmly, based on the evidence, based off of what the guest and consumer is telling us, that this is the bet we should place. But at the end of the day, you need to place the bet with your gut, right?
Yeah. Well, Brandon, I want to thank you for joining me today. Where are you most active? If I want to reach out and chat with Brandon or get a cup of coffee like I did with you, which is fantastic, where's a good place to get in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great. You can hit me up on my personal email, bjernigan@gmail.com, or you can check out my personal site, brandonjernigan.me.
Nice. Okay, cool. Well, thanks again, Brandon. It was a lot of fun talking to you.
Great. Thanks, Hurt.
Thank you for listening to The Schmidt List. If you want to learn more about how Foundry accelerates innovation, check out foundrymakes.com. And if you'd like me to speak about establishing a growth mindset at your conference or with your team, drop me a note at kurt@foundrymakes.com. Oh, and the next time you're on the internet, head to iTunes and leave the show a review. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, because sharing is caring. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show, and I hope you have a fantastic week.